Imagine a winter so harsh that the rivers froze solid for months. In the Middle Ages, from the 5th to the 15th century, millions of people faced exactly that, without radiators, without electric blankets, without supermarkets. Yet they survived. How? The answer lies in a combination of architecture, food, and community. The first line of defense was the home itself. Medieval houses were built with thick stone walls and tiny windows to trap heat. The hearth was the heart of the home, providing warmth, light, and a place to cook. Families would gather around it, sleeping on straw mats nearby to stay warm through the night. Food was another crucial survival tool. People preserved meat by salting and smoking it, and stored root vegetables like turnips and carrots in cool cellars. Grains were ground into flour for bread, which was a staple. A good harvest meant the difference between life and death when winter. Community was the final piece. Villagers shared resources, helped repair homes, and looked after the elderly and sick. In extreme cold, families would even share their homes with livestock, whose body heat helped keep everyone warm. Together, they endured the long, dark winters of the Middle Ages. The medieval climate was not uniform. The medieval warm period, from about 950 to 1250, brought milder winters and longer growing seasons across much of Europe. This allowed farmers to push cultivation into higher altitudes and more northern regions, expanding the agricultural base that supported population growth. But after 1300, the climate shifted dramatically. The Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and more frequent storms. Harvests failed, and the resulting famines weakened populations across Europe, setting the stage. To survive these harsh winters, medieval people developed sophisticated textile technologies. Wool was the most common fabric, but processing it required multiple steps: shearing, washing, carding, spinning, weaving, and fulling. Each step was often a specialized trade, and guilds regulated quality and training. Community cooperation was also essential. Villagers shared common pastures, maintained drainage systems, and rotated crops collectively. The open field system, with its strips of land farmed by different families, required constant negotiation and mutual aid. This social fabric was as important as any technology for surviving the medieval, especially in Northern Europe, but people adapted their homes. The typical peasant house was a single-room structure with a central hearth. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, but much of the heat remained trapped under the thatch. Walls were made of wattle and daub, a mix of mud, clay, and straw plastered over a wooden frame. This kept the interior surprisingly warm during harsh winters. But the hearth was more than just a heat source. It was the center of daily life. Over the fire, a cauldron hung from a hook, bubbling with pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat. This was the main meal, eaten from a shared bowl with a wooden spoon. The fire also provided light after sunset, when work stopped and families gathered to talk. Sleeping arrangements were communal. The entire family slept on a single large bed or on straw pallets near the hearth for warmth. Privacy was a luxury unknown to most. Livestock sometimes shared the same roof in a byre attached to the house, providing additional body heat. This close quarters living was practical, but it also meant that disease spread. Despite the hardships, medieval peasants found joy in festivals and church holidays. These breaks from labor were rare but cherished. Weddings, harvest feasts, and religious processions brought the community together. Music, dancing, and simple games provided entertainment. Even in a world of hard work and short life expectancy, people celebrated life whenever they could. Mud, straw, and animal dung, which provided excellent insulation. Windows were small and covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. At night, families slept on straw pallets near the hearth, often with livestock in the same building. Even castles, despite their stone walls, were often cold. Tapestries were hung on walls to block drafts, and rushes were spread on floors to absorb moisture. People wore multiple layers of wool and fur, even indoors. Heating was a luxury. Only the wealthy could afford fires in multiple rooms. The invention of the chimney in the 12th century was a game changer. Before chimneys, smoke from the hearth filled the room and escaped through a hole in the roof. The chimney allowed smoke to be channeled outside, making rooms warmer and less smoky. This innovation also enabled multi-story buildings with fireplaces on upper floors, and rugs were used as insulation, and fires in massive fireplaces were the only source of heat. But the real secret was layering, both in clothing and in sleeping arrangements. Straw mattresses, wool blankets, and fur coverlets provided significant insulation. And sleeping together, sometimes with multiple family members in one bed, was a practical way to share. This practice of communal sleeping wasn't just for warmth, it also reinforced family bonds. In an era without privacy as we know it, sharing a bed was normal. Children, parents, and even servants might sleep in the same room. The bed itself was often a valuable piece of furniture passed down through generations. But layering wasn't limited to the bed. People wore multiple layers of clothing: linen shirts, wool tunics, and heavy cloaks. Hats, hoods, and scarves were essential. Even indoors, people kept their cloaks on. And they used hand warmers, small metal boxes filled with hot coal. And then there was the kitchen. The hearth was the heart of the home, providing heat for cooking and warmth. People gathered around it, and the fire was kept burning day and night. But even with all these methods, winter was a struggle. Many did not survive the cold months, especially the elderly and the very young. Bed conserved body heat. Surviving winter also meant having enough to eat. Without refrigeration, medieval people relied on preservation techniques that had been refined over centuries. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were stored in cool cellars or buried in sand. Grains were kept dry in granaries. Honey was a precious sweetener that never spoiled. It was used to preserve fruits, creating a treat that could last through the cold months. And for those who could afford it, spices from the east, cinnamon, pepper, ginger, not only added flavor but also helped mask the taste of meat that was starting. But preservation wasn't just about food. Wood was seasoned, left to dry for months, so it would burn well without smoking up the hall. Hay was harvested and stored in barns to feed livestock through the winter. Every resource was managed with the knowledge that waste could mean death. These methods were not just habits. They were survival strategies passed down through generations. A medieval household that failed to prepare for winter faced a grim reality. But those who planned ahead, who salted the pork and stacked the firewood, could endure the darkness and cold until spring returned. Were kept in dry granaries. Cabbage was fermented into sauerkraut, providing vitamin C to prevent scurvy. Apples and pears were stored in straw-lined pits. Honey was used as a natural preservative for fruits. In northern regions, fish was dried or frozen. The key was planning. The autumn carefully managed to last through winter. But even the best-laid plans could fail. A bad harvest, a harsh winter, or a siege could lead to famine. In the winter of 1315, heavy rains ruined crops across Europe, triggering the Great Famine that killed millions. People ate tree bark, cats, and even rats. The lesson was clear: survival depended on preparation, but also on luck. Medieval people also preserved meat through salting and smoking. Salt was a precious commodity, often traded over long distances. A side of beef could be rubbed with salt and hung in a smokehouse for weeks. The result was a shelf-stable protein that could last through winter. Fish, especially herring and cod, were salted and dried, becoming staples of the medieval diet. Dairy products like cheese and butter were also preserved. Cheese was made from milk and aged in cool cellars. Butter was salted to prevent spoilage. These foods provided essential fats and proteins. In monasteries, monks developed sophisticated techniques for brewing beer, which was safer to drink than water. Beer was a source of calories and nutrients, and it could be stored for months. A frantic period of preparing for the lean months. And communities often shared resources, a practice known as commoning, whereby villagers pooled their grain and meat to ensure everyone had enough. Famine was a constant threat, but these strategies reduced the risk. Medieval clothing was surprisingly effective. The basic principle of layering, multiple thin garments trapped air for insulation, while a waterproof outer layer made from oiled wool or leather kept rain out. Even the poorest could stay warm. Footwear was equally practical. Leather turnshoes worn on either foot were cheap and easy to repair. A simple design that lasted centuries was layering. Next to the skin, people wore a linen shirt. Linen wicks moisture away. Over that, a wool tunic provided insulation even when wet. Outer garments were often made of wool or fur with hoods and mittens. Wool was the miracle fiber. It traps air, is naturally water-resistant, and could be felted or woven into dense cloth that blocked wind. But wool wasn't perfect. It could be itchy and heavy when wet. For the wealthy, there was silk, imported from the east along the Silk Road. Silk was light, smooth, and warm without bulk, but for most people, wool and linen were the staples. Footwear was simple but functional. Leather boots or shoes were common, often lined with wool or fur for warmth. Wooden clogs were worn over them in wet conditions to keep the leather dry. Hats were essential, wool caps, felt hats, or straw hats for summer. And everyone, rich or poor, wore a belt to hang tools. Clothing also signaled social status. Sumptuary laws dictated what each class could wear. Peasants were limited to earth tones, browns, grays, undyed wool. Merchants could wear brighter colors like blue or green. Nobles alone could wear purple, crimson, and fur like ermine or sable. Your clothes told everyone. Retains heat when damp. Sheep breeds were different from today, producing coarser, more insulating fleeces. Fur linings from rabbit, fox, or sheepskin added extra warmth. Leggings and boots were made of leather, often lined with fur or wool. Hats were essential. A woolen cap or hood could prevent massive heat. Loss through the head. Clothing was often layered, a linen shirt against the skin, a wool tunic over it, and a fur-lined cloak for outerwear. This trapped air between layers, creating insulation. Even simple straw stuffed into shoes or clothing added warmth. The key was trapping still air, which is a poor conductor of heat. Homes were designed for heat retention. The central hearth was the heart of the house, radiating warmth. Walls were thick stone or wattle and daub with small windows to minimize heat loss. Shutters were closed at night. Roofs were thatched, providing good insulation. Animals often lived in the same building, their body heat adding to the warmth. Bedding was also strategic. Straw mattresses were common, often stuffed with fresh straw each season. Wool blankets and fur throws provided insulation. Some slept on raised platforms to avoid cold drafts from the floor. In extreme cold, entire families would sleep together for shared body heat. Even pets like cats or dogs were welcomed into bed. Loss from the head. And contrary to popular belief, medieval people did change their underwear, though not as frequently as we do. The wealthy could afford silk or finer wools, but even peasants had access to decent woolen clothing. The technology of fulling, beating wool to mat the fibers, made cloth more durable and water-resistant. This was a game-changer for outer garments like cloaks and hoods. Meanwhile, linen remained the fabric of choice for shirts and underclothes because it was comfortable against the skin and could be washed vigorously. But washing clothes was a laborious task. Soap was made from animal fat and ash, and water had to be hauled and heated. So people didn't wash their clothes very often. Instead, they aired them out, brushed off dirt, and changed only the undergarments regularly. Outer garments were often passed down or repurposed. A tunic might start its life as a daily worker, then become a nightshirt, and finally end up as rags. This cycle of reuse was not just frugality. Medieval people also understood the importance of protecting their clothes from moths and mildew. Herbs like lavender and rosemary were placed in chests to keep insects away. And when a garment finally wore out, it was never simply thrown away. Every scrap of fabric was saved for patching, quilting, or making into something else. In a world where cloth was one of the most valuable possessions a person could own, waste was unthinkable. Denser and more windproof, but individual efforts were not always enough. When the Little Ice Age brought crop failures and livestock deaths, communities had to work together. Manorial lords often stored grain in barns and distributed it during shortages. Churches provided alms to the poor. Villages maintained common pastures. Denser and more windproof, but individual efforts were not always enough. When the Little Ice Age brought crop failures and livestock deaths, communities had to work together. Manorial lords often stored grain in barns and distributed it during shortages. Churches provided alms to the poor. Villages maintained common pastures. Denser and more windproof, but individual efforts were not always enough. When the Little Ice Age brought crop failures and livestock deaths, communities had to work together. Manorial lords often stored grain in barns and distributed it during shortages. Churches provided alms to the poor. Villages maintained common pastures. Denser and more windproof, but individual efforts were not always enough. When the Little Ice Age brought crop failures and livestock deaths, communities had to work together. Manorial lords often stored grain in barns and distributed it during shortages. Churches provided alms to the poor. Villages maintained common pastures. And woodlands for fuel. The concept of wintering involved reducing livestock numbers, slaughtering animals that could not be fed and preserving their meat. In extreme cases, people migrated to warmer regions or sought shelter in monasteries. The Great Famine of 1315–1317 was a stark reminder of how fragile this system was. When heavy rains and cold summers ruined harvests across Europe for 2 consecutive years, the stored grain quickly ran out. People ate seed grain, then turned to wild plants, and eventually to anything they could find. Chroniclers reported cases of cannibalism, though these accounts are often disputed. The famine killed an estimated 10 to 25% of the population in some regions. The crisis exposed the limits of medieval agriculture. Without crop rotation, fertilizers, or irrigation, farmers could not compensate for bad weather. The famine also triggered social unrest. Peasants abandoned their lords' lands, crime increased, and the church's authority was questioned. In the long term, the population decline led to labor shortages, which eventually improved conditions, wages, and more rights. The Great Famine was a preview of the even deadlier Black Death that would arrive 3 decades later. It showed that medieval society, for all its hierarchies and traditions, was ultimately at the mercy of the weather. The lesson was harsh. Without surplus and resilience, civilization itself can falter. System could be. Yet despite the hardships, medieval society developed robust coping mechanisms, mutual aid, careful resource management, and a deep knowledge of local environments. These were not passive victims of winter. They were active, ingenious survivors. So the next time you turn up the thermostat, remember that for centuries, winter was a force to be reckoned with, and our ancestors met it with resilience and wit. One of the most critical adaptations was the development of the heavy plow, which allowed farmers to till the dense, clay-rich soils of northern Europe. This innovation, combined with the 3-field crop rotation system, dramatically increased food production. More food meant larger populations could be supported, and communities could better weather the lean. Housing also evolved to combat the cold. The typical medieval longhouse was a multifunctional structure that housed both people and livestock under one roof. The animal's body heat helped warm the living quarters, and the central hearth provided heat, light, and a place to cook. Thick walls of wattle-and-daub, thatched roofs, and small windows minimized heat loss. And then there was the ingenuity in food preservation. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Vegetables were pickled or stored in root cellars. Grains were kept in dry granaries. Honey was used as a natural preservative for fruits. These methods ensured that even in the deepest winter, a medieval family could have a varied diet, though perhaps not as fresh. For centuries, people faced winter without modern conveniences. They built better homes, preserved food with skill, dressed in layers of wool and fur, and leaned on their community. Their survival was not a matter of luck. It was a triumph of human ingenuity, and that is a story worth remembering. From the first fire to the modern home, each generation added its own chapter to the story of winter survival.